Hello, everyone. I am Carmel Shachar, the Executive Director of the Petrie-Flom Center for Health Law Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics at Harvard Law School, and I have the pleasure of welcoming you to our virtual event addressing the overdose epidemic, substance use policy for the Biden administration. Before I turn it over to our substantive speakers, a few housekeeping notes. Really the virtual equivalent of where the bathrooms are. This is going to be a moderated discussion. We strongly encourage questions. We really welcome them from the audience. Now, as I say that, you may be asking, all right, well then how do I submit a question? There are two ways to do that. The first and best way is to go to the Zoom Q&A feature, which if you go down towards the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should see a little button that says Q&A. If you submit your question that way, Petrie-Flom staff, as well as our moderator, will be reviewing those questions and pulling them to ask our distinguished panelists. We also welcome you to join the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag substance use policy. Again, that's hashtag substance use policy. Petrie-Flom staff will be monitoring the Twitter, and if we see questions, we will pull them from Twitter and submit them into the Zoom Q&A. Two ways that are not effective for getting your questions to the panelists. The Zoom raise your hand feature is really cute, that little blue hand, but we will not be monitoring it. Likewise, please don't use the chat to submit questions. Please use the Zoom Q&A feature, or again, Twitter, hashtag substance use policy. With that, I would like to hand the event over to our moderator today, who is Mason Marks, Assistant Professor of Law at Gonzaga University, as well as Fellow in Ethics of Technological and Biomedical Innovation at the Edmund J. Safra Center and Petrie-Flom Center at Harvard University. Mason, take it away.
Thank you, Carmel. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Before I introduce our panelists, I'd like to thank the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics for sponsoring this event, as well as some of our Petrie-Flom staff, including Laura Chong and Chloe Reichel for their essential contributions. We have an incredible panel of experts with us today. We're joined by Washington State Representative Lauren Davis from Washington's 32nd Legislative District. We're also joined by Florida Representative Michael Grieco from Florida's 113th District. We're fortunate to have Jennifer Oliva with us, Professor of Law and Director of the Center for Health and Pharmaceutical Law at Seton Hall Law School. And we're grateful to have Leo Beletsky, Professor of Law and Health Sciences and Faculty Director of the Health in Action Lab at Northeastern University School of Law. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. It seems we're at a critical point for national drug policy. Overdose deaths have been rising rapidly over the past 20 years. In some cases, they've risen exponentially. And we don't have all the data in just yet from 2020, but it appears the COVID pandemic has made things much worse. In December, the Centers for Disease Control issued a press release reporting over 81,000 drug overdose deaths occurred in the 12 months before May 2020. The highest number of overdose deaths ever recorded in a 12-month period. And while part of that period was before COVID-19 arrived in the US, the latest numbers suggest overdose deaths have increased during the pandemic. According to the CDC, synthetic opioids, primarily illicit manufactured fentanyl, appear to be the primary driver of the increase in overdose deaths. In fact, deaths due to synthetic opioids increased by over 38% between 2019 and 2020. So things are not going very well from the perspective of reducing overdoses through our current national drug strategy. And that's what we're here to discuss today and how we might improve the situation. I'd now like to give each panelist about 1 to 2 minutes to tell us anything I may have missed during the introduction. And if they'd like, to answer the following question: what are the most pressing drug-related issues in your city or state? Or what national drug policy issue are you most concerned about? And I think we'll start with Representative Davis, and then we'll go to Professor Beletsky.
Great, thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here. So I represent the other Washington, the state work in the state legislature in Washington, and delighted to be here. You know, a couple things I would say about kind of the most pressing issues related to substance use policy in the state of Washington. One has been an ongoing issue, and I don't think this is unique to Washington, but this recognition that sort of the continuum of care for substance use disorder transcends sort of three parts: pre-treatment or outreach services to folks who are not engaged, treatment, and then recovery support services. But the truth is, insurance does not cover the pre-treatment or the recovery support services. And so what ends up happening is we pay for treatment over and over and over because we can bill the Medicaid cash cow, or we can bill commercial carriers, and then we blame people for failing treatment when in fact we failed to fund the pre-treatment and the recovery support services. So that is a huge area of focus, is trying to find flexible state dollars, whether it's new revenue or just convincing my colleagues that this needs to be a policy priority to fund the entire continuum if we really want to see success. And the second thing that I'll say is we have, on the 25th of February, we woke up in the morning and we became the epicenter of drug policy in the state because our Supreme Court struck down our state's entire controlled substances possession statute. And so we now have no criminal penalties for possession of any amount of controlled substances in the state of Washington. And so we are in session currently, and I'm actually voting as we speak, and we are wrestling with this really difficult policy question about what to do in response now that there's sort of a vacuum that's been created. What is the treatment response and what is the statutory response?
Thank you, and thank you for joining us. We'll go to Professor Beletsky next, and then Professor Oliva.
Thanks so much, Professor Marks, and thanks so much to Carmel and the entire staff of Petrie-Flom for organizing this. I think this is a really timely discussion, obviously, because of the window of opportunity that the new administration has to make some bold moves on substance use policy. And as you mentioned, Mason, there's been a major surge in overdoses in the context of COVID-19 that was actually already rising. There was a secular trend towards increased overdose that essentially skyrocketed during COVID-19. I just put some most recent data into the chat regarding numbers of overdoses that have gone up by our estimate 150% during the lockdown period, and overall around 50%. And I think the overarching point that I wanted to make at the outset, just to set the context, is that the Biden administration has not just a kind of a current obligation to address this, but the historical roots of a lot of the failed approaches that we're seeing. Really, the architect of those approaches is Joe Biden. And I think that there is an obligation, you know, part of the discussion here is ethics. I think there's a special obligation for the Biden administration to remedy a lot of the harms that have cascaded from the approaches that had been put in place many decades ago. Not assigning, you know, sort of sole responsibility, but definitely there's a lot of historical positions that he's taken that have really shaped our approach, especially in the criminal legal sphere, but not just in that sphere. So I would say that you know, there's probably three major buckets. So one is we need to really reform our criminal legal approaches and the role of the criminal legal system in addressing problematic substance use. We need to fix also the some of the issues that Representative Davis was talking about around treatment access, insurance, and all of those technical details for substance use treatment and support. And then I would also contend that we need to address the structural drivers, some of the underlying structural drivers of overdose, which you know, include both social economic issues as well as the infrastructure that has really failed us in the context of COVID-19 has been really on very stark display. I mean, we have a broken public health infrastructure in this country, and I think we need to completely rebuild and double down on prevention, on public health supports, on social supports, all of that. Those issues, those major structural issues, are at the root of our poor response to COVID-19, and at the root of our poor response to the overdose crisis before then, where we really, for now into the third decade, we've really failed to bend the curve of that crisis.
Thank you for that. Professor Oliva.
Thank you, Professor Marks, for having me. It's a privilege to be on this panel, and thanks always to Carmel and everyone at Petrie-Flom for putting on such a wonderful event. It's very difficult in such a flawed system that has historic roots in racism and ignores root causes of substance use and stigma against various different patient groups that have been marginalized over time, to pick just one thing. But if I did, I would say that drug policy in the United States is evidence defined. One of the missions of the Office of Drug Control Policy, it's the fourth thing in their mission statement, is to evaluate and measure whether the policies that we have in place are effective. I teach FDA law, and a system that does things from sort of a gut reaction and does the same things over and over and over and over again with bad results, that would be problematic in FDA law and the way we evaluate things pre-market and once they're on the ground. I actually looked up a report from the Government Accountability Office, which I have up right here on my screen, from March 2020. And they looked across the more than dozen agencies that have spends for federal drug control policy at just the federal level. And what the office of, what the GAO said was, from 1994 until March of 2020, the United States has spent more than $500 billion at just the federal level. You and Leo and the representative already mentioned that what we've gotten from that is incredibly poor outcomes, and outcomes that are increasingly worse and worse and worse. Skyrocketing overdoses, a much more deadly drug supply. So it's much more easy to succumb to something like fentanyl than other types of substances, polysubstance abuse. And I want to emphasize in my talk today, and I appreciate the opportunity, the collateral consequences of these drug wars are vast and wide and include marginalized communities, mass incarceration, and really terrible policies that have hurt people who have chronic comorbid conditions and persistent pain, and their lack of ability to access evidence-based treatment based on these policies.
Thank you. Representative Grieco.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. And you know, I come to you from Tallahassee, which is essentially South Georgia, but my home base is South Florida, which is essentially the epicenter of the opioid crisis when it comes to the pill mills. And I'm a criminal defense attorney. I used to be a prosecutor for many years, and South Florida was really ground zero for the pill mill and the abuse that was coming from the medical side. And you know, Florida alone, we're looking at about 70% annually of our overdose deaths in Florida. They come from opioids, and that has been a major concern in Florida for many years. And it's not something that you can just throw money at. But I come to it from a criminal defense and a criminal justice perspective in how Florida and the country as a whole has looked at nonviolent and drug offenses. Here for many years, it's been all about minimum mandatories. It's been all about locking people up, and a lot of them were users. It wasn't just people, you know, moving weight. It was people that really needed help. And there's been some shift in the process over the last few years, but it's been very, very slow, and it's become very costly. And what I find, I'm on the Democratic side of things. What I find is that, you know, what Professor Oliva was just talking about, you know, the long history of how we look at things and the racial disparities involved. You know, on my side, it's very easy to make those arguments. On the other side of the aisle, you almost have to pitch it like it's a financial or economic issue where, you know, we're essentially housing people to the tune of tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, in our prison systems and jails, simply for being, you know, being sick for having drug problems. So we've been, working that out over the years. It's a shifting conversation. And then lastly, and really the reason I was invited on this panel is that, I recently filed the first bill in Florida, which was then filed in Iowa, to start a legalization policy for psilocybin, what is historically known as magic mushrooms, which, became just as vilified as marijuana did back about 50 years ago, and just trying to shift the conversation about cannabis and about psilocybin as treatment, as opposed to it being just something that has been criminalized for way too long. But thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much. There's a lot to get into. There's no way we can cover everything in an hour, but we're going to do the best we can. I want to start the discussion by talking about pain, because it's hard not to talk about pain when we're talking about the opioid and overdose epidemic. In your view, how does pain factor into the overdose crisis, and what should the Biden administration do to respect and protect people experiencing pain? This is for anyone who'd like to jump in. Professor Oliva?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. I've been really focused on that recently. So pain is central to the entire story about opioids dating back into the 1800s, right? When you could sort of get morphine and opium, at your local corner store, and it was used to treat everything from child coughs to all sorts of gastrointestinal conditions. We cracked down, right, on those drugs at the time. And if you go back and look at the history, you'll see a lot of stigma around the concept of pain. This was with Civil War veterans and middle-aged women, and this sort of malingering concept and drug-seeking concepts that we still see today. We were under-treating and under-assessing pain. Virtually everyone in medicine agreed with that, and these were highly stigmatized, poorly understood conditions with poor treatment regimens. So we've shifted our focus back to that, right? And then we got ourselves into this opioid crisis. Then we shifted the pendulum really dramatically back again, as we always do, by having these sort of blunt force instruments, arbitrary dosing caps, got away from individualized treatment, individualized pain assessment, and a lot of people who had serious conditions that were opioid benign, they were responding clinically effectively for decades to being treated with opioids, were abandoned by their providers and force tapered because of law enforcement surveillance and this immediate shift and push down. My view is that however we got ourselves into this, we shouldn't have turned around and treated those people that way. There's no one in medicine who believes that it's medically appropriate to abandon patients in need, force taper them, or take them off medications that they have a long history of being able to take safely and be able to function. Pain, I'll say one last thing, pain is the #1 disability in the United States. This is no small matter. 50 some odd million Americans suffer pain, and about 10 million severe persistent pain. So there were a ton of folks, and there's egregious collateral consequences that have been suffered here while we had a myopic focus on just pushing prescribing down without doing individualized patient assessments.
Thank you. Yeah, when I was going through medical training, it was in the time when pain was treated as a vital sign, and we've certainly seen the pendulum shift dramatically. I'll go to Representative Davis and then Representative Grieco.
Thank you. So I just wanted to talk a little about a type of pain that I know more about, which is actually not physical pain. That's not my professional background, but emotional pain. And I think it's imperative that we talk about that. I know the question was obviously framed around the opioid epidemic and its roots, but I do think it's really important that we understand that individuals who are susceptible to developing a substance use disorder are very frequently individuals who have significant trauma in their past, and their use is really a manifestation of masking both the pain of their present circumstance and the pain of their past. And I think it's also important that we recognize that the parts of the brain centers that are activated with opioids that dull and numb that physical pain are the same brain centers that we know from neurology research that also numb emotional pain. And so we cannot divorce that from this conversation. And so a couple thoughts specifically on that. I mean, we know who are going to be young people who are susceptible for developing substance use disorder. There's a incredibly high correlation with adverse childhood experiences, and yet only 4% of pediatricians in this country screen for ACEs. So we could be intervening, but we don't even know who these kids are because we're not bothering to screen. And I think it's also imperative that we start teaching emotional regulation and distress tolerance skills to young people so that we give them alternative ways to cope with that pain and emotional dysregulation. Again, we have tools for that, but we don't teach that. And the number one reason people report that they're using substances is to feel different. But if we can teach people ways to cope with that trauma and ways to feel different outside of substances, I think that is where we should really be thinking about putting a lot of our resources.
Thank you. And I appreciate you pointing out that we should define pain broadly to include not just physical pain. Representative Grieco?
Yeah, and just to tack on to that, and Rep. Davis kind of stole my thunder, going back to what I've been talking about psychedelics. And the reason why that all came up is because we have so many folks in our state who are just resistant to traditional mental health treatment, specifically when it comes to PSD, specifically when it comes to depression. And the fact that the FDA has gone ahead and approved emergency use of certain psychedelics is something that's it's good to hear that we are kind of expanding our bandwidth when we talk about mental health. We have huge issues down here, especially with our veterans and with our youth. So I'm glad that Oregon has taken that first step, and there are other states now from both sides of the aisle. People are coming out and having those conversations. So in addition to everything that we've talked about so far, I do like that we are having a broader discussion about what is acceptable treatment and other ways to assist people who are resistant to what historically has been traditional treatments for certain issues, regardless as to what pain we're talking about.
And this is actually a perfect sort of sequence of comments, because I was going to submit that we should actually define pain even broader. So definitely physical pain, emotional pain, but also pain in a broader kind of structural context. Again, kind of harping on that point, we have a metaphor that we use when we talk about communities that are hurting. And lots of communities around the country are hurting because of social economic upheaval that's been really aggravated by the pandemic. And there's actually pretty decent evidence that social and economic upheaval are structural drivers of overdose, as well as other poor health outcomes. There's, some really interesting research around things like closures of auto plants and how that cascades into increased overdose rates, and other kind of large demographic and economic shocks that end up increasing risk of overdose, as well as other poor health outcomes. And so I think that having a public health focused social economic program and way of investing in communities is really critical to addressing those public health challenges, such as overdose. And that I don't see that being talked about in the sort of mainstream political context. And I think that that's a missed opportunity, because certainly we need to address, the criminal legal system and the treatment, the disaster that is the substance use treatment and recovery system. But without addressing the structural drivers, we won't make a lot of progress.
I have a quick question from the audience I'll pose to all panelists. What kind of data and evidence is available to help policymakers? So maybe when you're looking to find evidence about the overdose epidemic, where do you look? Where might members of the audience look if they want to find some numbers? What are the best places to look, and where might policymakers look?
The CDC has a pretty extensive set of data on the overdose crisis. Unfortunately, and this has been really interesting to see in the context of COVID-19, where we have pretty much real-time data on the number of cases, on the number of deaths, vaccinations, and so forth. There's been a data infrastructure that's been stood up in response to that crisis. Shockingly, we really don't have anything resembling that for overdose. Many times, I mean, the CDC data are typically about 2 years behind, 18 months or so. States and localities vary in their data infrastructure. There's also a lot of misclassification of overdoses both ways. Sometimes events that are not truly accidental overdoses are misclassified as accidental overdoses, and vice versa. And really the bias is varied depending on the community. There's just a lack of standards around medical examiner, coroner practices. It's a very, very flawed surveillance system. When I say surveillance, I mean public health surveillance, not kind of criminal legal surveillance. But I think that there's there's resources both on the actually on local and state and federal level where you can look up data from public health agencies, but the quality varies and there's a major time lag.
It sounds like investing some funds into better data collection might be a step forward. Professor Oliva?
Yeah, I cannot emphasize that enough. It's very important. And I also think, and I'll go back to my initial point and bounce off of what Professor Bolesky was saying was, we have not made an effort to measure these things in real time so that we can be immediately responsive to things before they get out of hand, right? Or go in a certain direction. Moreover, we seem to be very invested in sticky narratives that are not precise, that sort of create impression that the problem is X when it might be Y or Z. This overdose crisis has been shape-shifting. It's shifted quickly from prescription opioids to heroin to fentanyl. Now we have multiple categories of stimulants that the statistics tell us are more problematic right now in the illicit supply than anything to do with prescription medications. I will also highlight this again, since I am here today to talk about my pain research, but is that we didn't measure, for example, use rates. I mean, that is so hard. What kind of use rates do we have in the United States? It's so hard to get a real-time handle on that. So, and Leo says this in his paper or in his blog, right? We're always measuring sort of arbitrary things like number of arrests or people put in prison instead of, are we doing better? What are the health outcomes? How many people are actually suffering from this? And is it a real issue? The few studies that have been done that have looked at the risk of misuse on legacy patients who have used opioids long-term is incredibly small, circles around 1%. Once you take non-naive users out of that bucket. So that's a really small number. And these are the kind of statistics you don't sort of see in the headlines that can help us have a more nuanced, right, careful approach to how we implement policy in this area.
Representative Grieco, did you want to add something?
Yeah, so I want to just give it to you from the policymaker perspective, that you almost have to do like a minority report thing. You have to try to go the government route and try to obtain as much what you consider to be raw data as possible, and then you go to different medical organizations and as many sources as you can. And if you have the bandwidth, then it's great to be able to digest all of that and come up with some real data points. But the real concern, especially coming from government agencies, is whether or not there's an agenda. Whether, if they're working under an executive or even under a legislative branch that is, pushing a narrative or trying to hide a narrative, then you have to have an understanding that that's where that data is coming from. So, a lot of people, they just, they look at information and they think that facts are facts. But I learned, 20 plus years ago in college, it's very hard to establish that a fact is a fact. So that's the challenge from my perspective, not just from the criminal justice space, but from the healthcare space, is just getting as much data from as many public sources and private sources as possible and seeing where things line up to ensure that you're getting accurate information. So then you can go ahead and implement the appropriate policy, whether it be on the financial side or whether it be simply on the healthcare policy side.
Thank you for that. That's quite helpful. We have a question from the audience from Allison On. This is for Representative Davis. And I think I'm going to use this as an opportunity to ask you about the bill you recently sponsored. The question is, what would you hope to see as the first or next step for expansion of decriminalization in Washington and potentially in other states? So you sponsored a bill in February. Could you tell us a little bit about that and what you see as next steps?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So yeah, prior to this, what's known as the Blake decision in the Washington State Supreme Court, I had introduced a bill that would be similar to the Oregon model around the decriminalization of possession for personal use. And I think, what that's really rooted in is this recognition that I think everyone on this panel is well aware that not only is the criminalization of substance use disorder ineffective, it in fact pushes recovery further out of reach. So we know that one of the diagnostic criteria for substance use disorder is continued use despite negative consequences. And so it's just implausible then that adding additional negative consequences is going to lead to that cessation of use or behavior change. And in fact, the opposite is true. As I mentioned earlier, we know that drug use is a response to pain. And so people use drugs to really escape that painful reality of their present, and arrest and incarceration really compound the feelings of shame and worthlessness that are really at the root of substance use in the first place. So the conceptual, the idea then is that you would provide pathways, voluntary pathways to the full continuum of pre-treatment outreach, treatment and recovery support services for individuals with substance use disorder, and have really a proactive strategy, because in fact, we've been basically turning a blind eye to untreated substance use disorder in our communities. And so the idea would be that we need to do more, not less, but the more is not a criminal legal intervention. We know we have a lot of data in our state that between 80 and 98% of individuals with substance use disorder, people in encampments, will accept services if it's delivered by the right messenger and it's the right services. But yet only 11% of those folks actually ever receive substance use disorder services. And so closing that delta for those who are voluntary, and then again, for those who continue to commit crimes, other things will remain in the criminal code, things like theft and criminal trespass and forgery. And so give me 1 second. I think I have to vote in committee. Davis votes aye. I apologize. This is the nature of a virtual session. So I think that that's really the hope, is that you are serving the 90 to 95% of folks who are willing and providing them Cadillac services, and you don't drop them on their head when the day they release from treatment. You provide them a comprehensive continuum of recovery housing, access to transportation, access to childcare, support to quash warrants and deal with criminal legal system interventions. And if there's a return to use, you support people instead of making them fall all the way back to the bottom. And for the small minority of folks who, again, are in active addiction and unwilling to accept that voluntary help, you have maybe mechanisms through the criminal legal system that do come with more accountability, but we don't need that for simple possession. We just don't. And in Washington State, we also have civil commitment for folks with substance use disorder. And so that population who would be unwilling voluntarily would be eligible for that as well.
Thank you. Very, very impressive voting skills. Would anyone else like to comment on anything Representative Davis just discussed?
I think Representative Grieco, and then I'd love to make a comment.
Yeah, so first I'd like to say that Rep Davis and I were private messaging, and I'm very jealous that she gets to vote remotely while they make us essentially vote in person for everything. They talk about Florida man. I'm surrounded by Florida men. So, but listening to Rep Davis talk about the policies and the way things are moving in Washington, if it wasn't so cold, maybe I'd move there, because you guys are starting to get it right. It's a real uphill battle in Florida and in a lot of states. that are like Florida when it comes to the breakdown of the legislature and just the backwards thoughts regarding simple possession. I filed plenty of efforts in legislation to move the needle on these types of things, and it's just not happening. Especially on the House side, it's just very conservative. The Speaker of the House, who is a friend of mine, but he's got a prosecutor's mentality when it comes to drugs, minimum mandatories, and it's just very challenging trying to move the needle in Florida and states like Florida on decrim, even on misdemeanor amounts of small little nominal amounts of marijuana, and we're trying to talk about decrim on simple possession of cocaine and things like that. It's just nobody wants to talk about it down here and similar states, so it's frustrating. So I'm definitely I think I'm just chiming in just to say how jealous I am of my colleague in the Northwest.
And I just wanted to kind of piggyback on what's been said already, which is I really was heartened to hear Representative Davis talk about the folly of trying to use heavier and heavier sanction to modify behavior of folks who, by definition of their disorder, are not responsive to negative sanction. That's the actual clinical definition of substance use disorder. But I think there's a broader point to be made in a context of what we talked about before, which is data, that we really need to be much more focused on how we define problematic substance use, and the traditional kind of war on drugs has really permeated the scientific sphere in many ways, including the fact that any use of an illegal substance is defined as abuse, which is in itself a problematic term. I mean, the term abuse is a term of art for criminal law, spousal abuse, child abuse, and so forth. And so if we're trying to reframe our language, or if we're trying to reframe our approach away from a criminal legal system, we probably shouldn't be using a criminal legal term to describe what the issue is. But in many scientific spheres, we're still using a person reporting any cannabis use as abuse, or any heroin use as abuse, because these substances are illegal. They're also illegal because people are abusing them. So it's kind of like a circular logic. The reality is that by far, not everyone who uses certain substances has a substance use disorder. And this very much permeates also the kind of the new approaches, the kindler, gentler approaches that are percolating both on a federal and state level, where folks are saying, okay, we shouldn't use, criminal legal sanction to address these issues, but we need treatment. So in a lot of drug courts, for example, a lot of folks who participate in drug courts are folks who were caught with small amounts of drugs, whereby the fact that they were caught with small amounts of drugs is considered a sort of a trigger for them to enter a drug court treatment program, where they will have to, oftentimes show up several times a week or sometimes every day to participate in groups. It'll impose lots and lots of surveillance and other kinds of obligations on them, very, very arduous, and probably ones that I would have a hard time meeting if I were in that program. So it's really, I think the broader point that I'm trying to make is that when we design programs that are alternatives to incarceration, we need to do so critically without sort of following the same path that the criminal legal system has laid out. And same concerns also apply in my mind to the some efforts to reframe incarceration or retool incarceration as treatment. So there's this increasing tendency to say, well, we're going to detain folks for their own good. So Representative Davis has alluded to involuntary commitment. So in the state of Massachusetts, for example, involuntary commitment means that folks are going to be essentially incarcerated. They're detained in by the Department of Corrections for the most part. About 65% of the men are detained by the Department of Corrections. They're until very recently really were not given evidence-based treatment. They were essentially put into an abstinence-based program. And a lot of the research that's been done on involuntary commitment really demonstrates that essentially what's happening is that, with this push, anti-incarceration push, the criminal legal system has essentially rebranded a lot of their approaches that had been standard to be now defined as treatment, whereas the substance of what is actually happening to folks is very much of the old sort of mentality of incarceration and abstinence-based approaches, and then folks are kind of abandoned, and a lot of them overdose and die very soon after.
I'm glad you brought up drug courts. Before I go to Professor Oliva, I just want to bring this kind of back to the Biden drug policy. Two elements of Biden's plan, at least when he was campaigning, were to increase reliance on drug courts and mandatory treatment. So I'm glad that we kind of just kind of fell into that organically. Professor Oliva?
Yeah, I'll just go ahead and answer that question. I did want to compliment Professor Valesky for mentioning like how we talk about treatment or harm reduction and these kinds of words now. You look at the budget and how money is getting spent. And this is, I feel frustrated for the representatives on here because again, you're going to be getting some kind of statistic, but what does that mean? Well, what kind of treatment are people getting? Are they being put in a detox only? Are they actually getting evidence-based treatment? That makes your job even harder to do. But as far as drug courts, it is in the Biden plan. I find that somewhat unfortunate from the perspective that there's no evidence that drug courts actually reduce incarceration or coercive, forced involuntary treatment. Actually, and I think Rep. Davis mentioned this earlier, actually help 99.9% of folks who may have some kind of issue. Drug courts are also, and Professor Valesky actually already kind of gave us all this, but they're very cherry picked who gets to go in or out of drug courts, right? It's a sort of post-arrest process, so you're getting punished. People who really may need help often are excluded from drug courts. They won't, if you have a comorbid condition or a psychiatric condition, you're often automatically excluded. One of the exclusionary criteria to get treatment through a drug court is that you've had past substance use issues. I mean, so when we're talking about evidence and looking at things, I think the drug court model is particularly problematic. I'm going to give Washington State a shout out here now. Kings County had a lead program out there, and they didn't just do the program. They didn't just do pre-arrest, housing first, full wrap case management. They did it and hired at the same time people to actually measure the effect of the program. Ford Foundation paid for epidemiologists and statisticians to come in and measure the effects. And across the board, that program was a success compared to traditional drug courts. So I just want to emphasize that there is some evidence there. That was a very well done study. And I think Rep. Davis actually probably speak to this, but my understanding is that although it was at least partially privately funded at first, Kings County and Seattle things thought it was cost effective and so helpful that they started publicly actually funding the program. But I know we have an expert on here about that, so I'll stop.
Thank you. Representative Grieco?
Yeah, so just on the drug court piece, I mean, down in Miami, we did the first drug court in Florida, and it's expanded throughout the state. It's been a model, and it's actually been pretty effective here. We've expanded it to we have a drug court, we have a mental health court, and there's a lot of communication between the two for dual diagnosis patients. And they really do. They bring them in, and they don't call them defendants; they call them patients, which is an important. It seems like it's just words, but it's not just words. And we've expanded it actually to a veterans court now. So they all kind of communicate amongst each other, not just in Miami now, but statewide. And, it's worked for us. Obviously it's different strokes for different folks. I know there's other states, there's other attorneys and or state representatives that I speak with in other states where it just doesn't work. And it really is just it's just a cover to keep it as a punitive model. And it makes everybody feel better. But where we are, it's been effective. They do treat them as patients. It's very rare that and it's also for first-time offenders or first-time offenders light. That's really where the problem lies, is that drug court is not perpetually available to folks just because, if you're a convicted felon, you're automatically disqualified from drug court. I think that we have the opportunity to expand the model to really make it available to more than just first-time offenders. But again, like I said earlier, Florida is kind of, we're the last to do a lot of things, and I have a feeling that we're going to be years away from a model where we embrace the idea of treatment beyond just first-time offenders.
Thank you. Representative Davis.
Thank you. Yeah, so you touched in the Biden plan on two issues that I have very strong opinions on: drug court and civil commitment. So I'll try to address both quickly here. Around drug court, what I really want to do is echo the comments that were made earlier by my wonderful new colleague around the cherry picking that occurs for drug court. So they have great outcomes, but we really have to look at that critically about who they admit to the program. And we also know there are significant racial disproportionalities with who is admitted to the program. We see this in Washington, particularly because the prosecutor in Washington has to consent to allow an individual to participate. I will say, as a general rule, I support multiple pathways to recovery, and that includes drug court. And in fact, I have some very close friends who are in long-term recovery because of drug court. So I don't want to completely knock the program, but there was a study done in Philly of some 900 people who had died of overdose, half of whom had contact with the criminal legal system, and only 9 of whom had ever been offered the chance to participate in drug court. We also know that individuals who are discontinued from drug court, rather than sort of being supported, who are discontinued and for not, meeting the requirements, they serve longer prison sentences than they otherwise would have if they had not participated in the program. So on to civil commitment. I occupy a unique space in the substance use realm. I am a ardent supporter of civil commitment for substance use disorder. In fact, that's how I accidentally got myself elected, as I was volunteer lobbying the Washington State Legislature around a bill called Ricky's Law, named after my best friend, associated with civil commitment for substance use disorder. And my Ricky nearly died in our system when I was much younger, in my early 20s, over 75 emergency department visits, 3 times on life support and intensive care, 6 psychiatric hospitalizations, multiple suicide attempts, all related to untreated substance use disorder. And he, like so many, he didn't have that stop valve. But I think what's really noteworthy is, so this Ricky's Law passed in 2016, went into effect in Washington State in 2018, and the data is extraordinary. So individuals who are initially civilly committed involuntarily for substance use disorder, between 80 and 98% of them are consenting to voluntary continued care. Because it is true that people have to want to stay in recovery, but everything we know about brain science suggests that the parts of the brain that are responsible for volition and choice and decision-making and impulse control are complicit in the addiction process. And Gabor Mate describes it as the watchman is aiding the thieves. The parts of the brain that are supposed to help you make decisions for your body and your health are incapable. And so I do think, it's a minority of folks, right? It's, maybe less than 10% who are not going to voluntarily accept services. And it depends on the person and the day, right? You might have somebody willing to accept voluntary services one day and not on a different day. But having that crisis service for folks is really imperative. But I will also say that civil commitment should always be a last resort. And I have huge issues with the Massachusetts Section 35 model of using the criminal legal system as the place to warehouse these individuals. I think there are also issues with Florida's Marchment Act, which is civil commitment, because their program is court-based and it's not an emergent detention. There's no emergency way to help somebody in a crisis. You have to petition the court Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. And then the other model nationwide is Casey's Law. The only issue with that is, and that's Ohio and Kentucky, it's only available to families of wealth because the family has to pay for the treatment. So I really think it works, but it works if you're giving people care in a trauma-informed setting. You're following evidence-based practices. You're giving them access to medications for opioid use disorder. You're setting them up with recovery housing and the full continuum of resources. And if you do that, you can effectively serve that minority of folks who maybe are unwilling to consent to voluntary services, and you serve them outside of the criminal legal system because it's through the civil system.
I want to return to civil commitment in just a moment because I think it's very important. But I want to give Representative Grieco a chance to talk about his bill that he sponsored in February, I believe. Can you tell us a little bit about that and why it's important to Floridians?
Sure. So I touched on it a little earlier because I didn't know if we were going to have enough time to address it, and I'm not going to go too far down the rabbit hole. But you know, with a couple of years ago, with the FDA approving emergency use for psilocybin, which for the layperson is magic mushrooms, going back to the early 70s, where they were doing studies about its effective use on traditional depression medication and patients. It was working, and then something happened in the early 70s. A certain person got elected, wanted to criminalize essentially all drugs, including cannabis and including all psychedelics. But we're starting to change the conversation. And Oregon, what they did last year, obviously really changed the national conversation on this. And we're seeing multiple states now, and from both sides of the aisle. When I filed my bill in Florida, and Forbes and a few other national publications picked it up, I was getting calls from several Republicans in several states who were embracing the concept, and a lot of it had to come with veterans treatment and just overall mental health treatment, and coming up with unique solutions for huge populations of folks who are just, if they're resistant to traditional medicine, then they are going to go to black market options. And what my bill would do is it would create a pilot program in the universities to allow it to be fully studied the way they're doing it in Canada now, and then possibly rolling it out to where there would be an opportunity for a more expansive access for the average citizen, the average patient. So it wasn't going to get traction this year. I filed it as kind of a shot across the bow so I could spend the summer kind of chipping away at some of the majority members. But on the Senate side, they like it, and it's something to keep an eye on, because I think it's going to move next year.
Thank you. That's great. And for people who don't know, psilocybin was designated a breakthrough therapy by the FDA for major depressive disorder and treatment-resistant depression, which suggests that it may be a significant improvement over existing therapies. I want to return to civil commitment, if anyone would like to comment on that further or discuss it further before we wrap up.
Yeah, I'll just say quickly that I generally agree with Representative Davis, and she's listed a lot of caveats in terms of civil commitment being the last resort, it being an emergency, very limited intervention. We have that for mental health in many settings, and arguably that should actually be sufficient rather than having a specific provision for substance use disorder. In Massachusetts, they're very diametrically opposed. The substance use disorder section of the law is very expansive and very, very arbitrary, whereas the mental health is just as you described, delimited. The clinician makes the call of whether or not the person should be committed. It's for 72 hours. So it's, there's a separate and unequal system for mental health versus substance use. But I just wanted to highlight that, even just the very idea of this being the last resort is unfortunately not how in many settings civil commitment gets deployed. And I think that there is major both substantive and ethical issues around civil commitment in terms of, people essentially being arrested and detained without a trial, and the process being very difficult to challenge for individuals. And so you're opening up quite a dangerous sort of ability of the state to deprive people of the liberty based on oftentimes a very arbitrary and kind of a rubber stamp role for the judges. The problem, I think, in many settings, including the Massachusetts system is the one I know well. For a lot of folks, there are no other options. And so the civil commitment system is on demand. It's free if you don't have insurance. It requires very little navigation. So all of the barriers that exist in accessing voluntary treatment go away when you enter the involuntary commitment space. So instead of being a last resort option, it becomes a first resort option where, kind of the choice architecture towards civil commitment is extremely aligned. The choice architecture around accessing voluntary treatment on demand for free is almost non-existent in many spaces. So it's become this kind of a fallback default mechanism, and it really shouldn't ever be that way. And not to say, I would never say that, this is something that, maybe shouldn't exist at all in the context of people who are really have lots of complex issues and maybe at imminent danger. I don't know that, again, we need a separate system for mental health versus substance use. And certainly we have to invest in the voluntary system to allow people to access resources first. And, if multiple chances and opportunities to pursue recovery are not working, and the current system is just very broken. But if we had the most optimal system and people still were not able to gain their footing, then perhaps in some cases an emergency hold, very limited, would be warranted.
Thank you. We are running short on time. There are many, many topics we could get to that we won't be able to get to today. I want to borrow a practice from our faculty director, Glenn Cohen. I know you're all on Twitter. Hopefully you're not too addicted to it, but he likes to ask people to give their final thoughts in the form of a tweet. So if you are going to leave people with what you feel is most important to know about substance use, or perhaps what you might like our national drug policy to look like, what would that tweet look like? Would anyone like to volunteer to go first?
I'll go first.
Thank you.
The White House should stop firing people for smoking weed at some point in their lives. It's a bad look.
Excellent, thank you. Professor Beletsky?
I guess I would say that there's urgent action that has to be taken by the current administration, and nothing short of major bold steps will suffice.
Thank you. Professor Oliva?
I guess I'm just going to say, stop stigmatizing people with, serious healthcare conditions who have been marginalized. We've done the marginalization, we've done the stigmatization, we've done this criminal model for 100 years. It's completely ineffective. It's broken. It's super expensive. And it's time to walk away from that for both folks with chronic pain conditions, mental health issues, and individuals who have, in fact, struggled with substance use disorder.
Thank you. Representative Davis?
I would say close the delta between the 11% of people with substance use disorder who receive services and treatment and the over 90% who are willing. Let's talk about that. Let's build that system. Let's fund that system first. That should be priority number one. #recovery happens.
Very good. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining us. It's been a lot of fun. I'm sure we could talk for a long time. I look forward to having future conversations with you. Thanks to the Petrie-Flom Center, and thank you to the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics. Have a great day.
Thanks so much.